So I set off early the next morning. The cool country breeze was rippling through my hair as I sped through the forested roads out of town. I'd borrowed my wife's car, winding along the roads that led to my uncle's house. A frail voice had answered the phone when I called, sounding slightly standoffish at first. I thought perhaps I'd got the wrong number, until I explained who I was, and that frail voice seemed to fill with delight, exclaiming how it was good to hear my voice, and that he'd missed seeing me and the rest of my family. He'd invited me over the very same day to catch up, giving me his address and sounding intrigued as I explained that I had a strange issue that he might be able to help with. As I took in the sights and sounds of those country roads, it was the closest I'd come to feeling relaxed ever since the incident with Carl. The rolling fields, thick trees with the sun cresting over them, and quiet empty roads were serene, calming my shot nerves. After several minutes of driving, the tree line shrank back, revealing a large house a short distance away with a narrow gravel road leading up to it. Taking the turning, I made my way up the well-kept road, taking in the meticulously trimmed grass of the fields flanking it. As I approached the large manor house, in awe of the many large windows adorning its brick surface, I couldn't help but feel a slight sense of shameful envy when I thought about my wife and my small 2-bedroom house. Still, I couldn't help but be amazed by the place. It was beautiful, and every inch of its outer appearance seemed to be kept as meticulously pristine as the lawns I'd driven past. Pulling up to a stop in the large, cream gravel driveway, I stepped out of my car, unable to tear my eyes away from the place. "So, what do you think?" I heard a voice call out. It was frail, but seemed full of energy. Scanning around for the source of the voice, I looked up. Leaning on the sill of one of the slightly open windows was an older-looking man. His grey hairs were sparse on his head, balding skin visible underneath. A tired expression held his wrinkled face, but vibrant blue eyes were dazzling with the fire of youth beneath its brow. He grinned as he met my gaze. My uncle. "I can't believe how much you've grown. Last time I saw you, you were just about able to walk, and look at you now." "It's got to have been 25 years. Yes, at least that. My word. You've certainly got the family look about you, that's for sure." His eyes widened in a flash, as though suddenly realizing a pressing matter that had slipped his attention. "Look at me, chatting away out of the window while you're standing there. How rude of me. Please, come in, get warm, and we can continue somewhere more comfortable." He raised a wizened hand and gestured towards the door. "It's unlocked. I knew you were coming, so just let yourself in, and I'll meet you down in the hall." And with that he was gone, hobbling off past the edge of the window, disappearing completely from view. A little taken aback by the enthusiasm of my uncle, I walked across the crunching gravel path until I stood at the looming, solid oak doors barring the entrance of the manor house. Reaching for the intricate golden handle, my hand hesitated for a second as I felt a sense of nervousness swelling up in me. Yes, this man was my uncle, and yes, he'd seemed excited to see me. But I didn't really know him. I was basically about to walk into a stranger's house. After a second, I shook the thought off. I needed answers, and my uncle seemed like my best bet at the moment. And he was still family after all. I grasped the handle firmly and twisted my wrist to the right, feeling the heavy weight of the solid door as it slowly opened on well-oiled hinges. My jaw dropped again as the interior of the manor became clearly visible. The polished marble floor spread out in all directions, spotless and gleaming. Adorning the beautifully decorated walls were several oil paintings depicting various landscapes. The walls themselves were lined with stone plinths, topped with expensive-looking vases filled with fresh flowers. I felt like I'd walked into an art museum, and for a second, that feeling of envy reared its ugly head again. The light tapping of a walking stick on marble from somewhere above me grabbed my attention. I looked to the top of the large staircase to see my uncle standing there, waving to me, gesturing for me to come to him. Although I'd seen him when he spoke to me from the window, I'd only managed to see his face and torso. The rest of him had been obscured by the walls of the manor. Now that he was standing before me, I could clearly see the extent of his frail frame. He was a taller man, even with the natural stoop that seemed to come with age. He looked like all of the decisions of his lifetime had weighed heavily on him. A green velvet housecoat covered the majority of his sickly frame, draped over his thin limbs like a coat on a rack. Still, his aging body and paper skin did not seem to slow him down. He was grinning that same genuine smile as I closed the door behind me and began to ascend the stairs towards him. "My boy, it's so good to see you again," he said, taking my hand and excitedly shaking it. His grip was impressive for someone of his years. It felt like the handshake of a much younger man. "This way, follow me. My study will be a more comfortable place for us to catch up, and to discuss the matter that you mentioned." And before I could utter a word, he turned on his heel and was making his way down the corridor with impressive speed, his walking stick clicking loudly against the marble floor with each step. I had to set off at a slight jog to catch up to him, and even then I was having to put in a great deal of effort just to maintain pace. As we walked through a couple of winding corridors of the manor, my uncle proceeded to ask me a myriad of questions about my life, as though he was trying to fit 25 years worth of lost time into the short walk. He was part of the way through regaling me with a tale from his youth, when he stopped dead outside of another large oak door. "Here we are," he said, and pushed the door open to reveal the room beyond. His study was as beautifully decorated as the rest of the manor. However, there were more creature comforts added to this room. Large rugs adorned the marble floor, housing a writing desk along with two large plump armchairs positioned on either side of a large hearth. Come, grab yourself a seat and I'll get the fire going," he said, ushering me into one of the larger chairs before sliding over to the hearth and messing with the mass of logs that filled it. Within a few moments, he jumped back with a start, the erupting flames licking what remained of his thinning hair, before chuckling to himself about his close call. "That's one way to do it," he exclaimed. Then, making his way to his writing desk, he grabbed a large crystal decanter filled with a golden brown liquid and proceeded to measure out a small amount into 2 crystal glasses. Looking around the room, I couldn't help but wonder what it was my uncle had done for a job. My parents had probably told me before, but I couldn't for the life of me remember. They were right about one thing though. He was odd. Harmless enough, but odd. Passing one of the glasses to me, he proceeded to sit in the other large chair opposite mine, sinking into it as though being slowly absorbed. "I know you drove here, but one can't hurt," he said, smiling at me and gesturing to the glass before taking a large swig of his. For several hours we sat there, telling each other about our lives and expressing how sorry we were that we'd not seen each other for so many years. I'd explained how my parents said we weren't allowed to see him anymore, after whatever it was that had happened all those years ago. As I said this, I could see my uncle's face visibly flush, and he sheepishly responded, "Ah, yes. Well, I can't exactly blame them. But I do miss them both dearly. You will tell them that when you next see them, won't you?" A part of me desperately wanted to know what it was that had gone on. What could possibly have driven such a wedge between them? But from the way my uncle had reacted, I could tell it wasn't a subject that he would feel comfortable exploring. At least, not yet. A momentary lull in the conversation followed, as my uncle's eyes seemed to drift to some faraway place. After a few seconds, they focused again, as though he'd snapped himself out of the haze of memory that he'd just been trapped in. Anyway, enough about all that. You came to me because you said you needed my help. I'm flattered, but what exactly could I help you with that no one else could? Forgive me for saying this, and please don't think I'm ungrateful, but it must be something significant for you to reach out to me after all these years. He fixed me with his youthful eyes, expectant and eager to help. It was at that moment I became aware of exactly how stupid I'd felt. I'd reached out to him, driven all the way here, worried him into thinking something horrific was going to happen, and now I was going to tell him about some strange thing that's happened with a dog that I'd found. I was almost questioning if I should go ahead with it, if I should just apologise for wasting his time and leave instead. With his expectant gaze filled on me the whole time, I decided to bite the bullet. What was the worst that could happen? I proceeded to tell him about the dog, about everything that had happened, bracing myself for the hysterical laughter I was sure would follow. As I relayed my story, his expression seemed to morph from inquisitive to curious, and finally to one of deep concern as every last detail of the past few weeks was laid out in front of him. As the last words left my lips, I was aware of a warm sensation running down my face. Tears. I'd been so caught up reliving the details that I didn't even realise I'd been crying. This was the first time I'd actually tried to process anything that I'd seen over the last few weeks. My uncle pulled a handkerchief from the top pocket of his housecoat, gently handing it to me, gesturing for me to take it with a comforting smile on his face. "My boy, that sounds just awful indeed," he said. "I'm so sorry you're going through this, and I'm going to try my damned hardest to help in whatever way I can." I appreciated his kind words, and for a moment, I let myself feel like perhaps he actually would be able to help me. Maybe he'd be able to figure out what this dog was, figure out a way to stop it. But with that thought, a cold washed over me. What if he found something that was the opposite? Something that proved the dog wasn't real, that it was all in my head, that I was going mad. I had no idea what he could have told me to prove that, but it scared me all the same. "Now I can see why you came to me. Your parents no doubt mentioned my spiritual interests, I assume." As he mentioned my parents, he seemed to drift off slightly again, before regaining his composure and returning to his train of thought. "Well, from what you've told me, it does sound otherworldly, of that I'm certain. What I'm not certain of is what exactly it is." "There are a few categories it fits into," he continued. I could tell he was thinking hard, practically hearing the rusting cogs of his aged mind turning, scouring through a lifetime's worth of knowledge. Things like omens. You know, signs that show up just before something bad happens, like war, disease, or death. Throughout history, people have seen omens at several different times. However, they only normally appear to a person once. They don't tend to follow them around. "And then there's the case of its changing appearance," he said, trailing off again. He sat there for what felt like hours, racking his brain in the silence of the study. The only sound was that of the crackling fire as the logs popped and snapped in the heat. After some time, he turned to face me, a saddened, defeated expression on his face. "I'm sorry, my boy. I can't think of any such creature that I'm aware of. Although there's one thing I'm certain of. Based on its pattern and its behaviour, it's not a benevolent entity." He looked me dead in the eyes, and what he said next sent a chill running through me. "You need to be careful. Things of that nature, once they latch onto something or someone, they don't tend to go away." I thought about each time I'd seen that dog, and the deaths that seemed to shortly follow. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead, and I shivered despite the warmth of the fire as I imagined it following me, latching on, tethered to me for some unknown sinister purpose. I couldn't help but wonder if maybe it was already too late. Sensing my darkening thoughts, my uncle grabbed his walking stick and struggled from the comfort of his armchair to his feet. Looking down at me, he uttered one sentence, "Come this way," before he began to march to the door with that same unnatural speed, suddenly vanishing around its corner. Slumping out of the chair, I got to my feet, forcing myself to follow. I dragged my feet slightly as I walked. This had been a disaster. I came here for answers, but I was still none the wiser. If anything, I was more scared than I had been last night. We walked along another marbled corridor, passing a few more large oaken doors, before coming to a stop in front of another. Gently turning the handle and allowing it to swing open, my uncle stepped inside, beckoning me to follow. My eyes met with the sight of books, shelves upon shelves of books. They lined the walls, stretching from the floor to the ceiling. There wasn't an inch of the large open space before me that wasn't covered. It was truly an impressive sight. Had I not been reeling from the idea that the dog was a monstrous, evil entity that was latching itself to me, but then I would have been truly amazed. I can't promise it'll be quick. It might take me a few weeks, heck, even a few months, but I'll search through everything I have. One of these has to have some answers, something that sounds familiar, something to help at least, he said, turning his head and scanning his eyes across the wall of tomes before me, a genuine expression of pity and sadness on his face. "I'm just sorry I can't do more." I couldn't believe it. Here was this man, old and frail, not having seen his nephew for over 25 years, who then came to him with the strangest story he'd heard for a while, and he was willing to do whatever he could for this person he hardly knew. I couldn't help a smile rising to my face, even less so the tears forming in my eyes. For the first time in such a long time, I felt like I wasn't alone. Like things might actually start turning around. Like I might finally get some answers. Thank you so much. You have no idea what this means to me," I said, fighting back the cracking of my voice that threatened to spill over into a full-blown crying fit. Just then, a shrill ding from my pocket drew my attention. It was a text from my wife, asking how much longer I think I'll be as she's starting dinner soon. Checking the time, I jumped with a start. In all of the catching up and discussion, I'd lost track of time. Turning to my uncle, it was as though he was able to read my thoughts somehow, saying, "My goodness, look at the time. No doubt your wife will be wondering where you are. Please, don't worry, you'd best get going. I'll let you know as soon as I find anything." He started making his way back to the main hall again, the sound of his walking stick clacking along the marble corridor. Gratefully, I followed him, the thoughts of our meeting now swirling along with the oppressive thoughts from before, banishing them from my mind. Things were really going to start getting better. I could feel it. I stopped at the large, oak double doors, opening them with ease, revealing the beautifully kept driveway beyond. "Thank you for today, my boy. It's not often I get visitors anymore. Not ones that aren't trying to sell me something at least. I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed having company." A wave of melancholy spread across his face as he spoke. "I'll let you know as soon as I have anything that could help." He paused for a second, before saying, "You will come and visit me again, won't you? It would be good to see you. You're more than welcome to bring your lovely wife with you next time as well. I would so very much like to meet her." Although he tried his best to hide it, his tone betrayed a hint of desperation. I couldn't help but feel a swell of pity rising. This kindly old man was willing to help me, to listen to my crazy story and actually help me. He'd asked for nothing in return, just company. I clasped his frail old hand in mine and shook it firmly, looking him in the eyes as I told him that I would most definitely return. I'd bring my wife with me and we could all stop for dinner. His eyes seemed to light up with gratitude and a soft smile spread across his face. As I released his hand and stepped into the driveway, I thanked him once again. Making my way across the fine gravel to my car, I opened the door and sat myself inside. I couldn't help but almost feel relaxed. The most relaxed I'd been for weeks. Starting the engine, I turned the car around with ease in the spacious driveway. Looking back, I waved one last goodbye to my uncle as I began to make my way down the path towards the main road. In my rearview mirror, I could see him return it before making his way back inside and closing those large double doors. The car trundled along the path as I took in the serene, beautifully maintained surroundings once again. That place really did seem idyllic, especially the view of the rolling hills in the distance, beyond the hedges bordering the house. Just as I was staring off, admiring the view, something caught my eye. It was only brief, but I swear I saw something moving. Only slightly, just beyond the hedge. An eerie feeling seemed to creep along my spine, climbing towards my scalp, although I couldn't place why. It ate away the happy, relaxed feelings I'd been enjoying not 10 minutes ago, until I felt the same as I had for the past several weeks. As I started to round the corner, the movement from the hedge returned. I'd definitely seen it this time, unobscured now that my car was just rounding the gate. All I could do was stare numbly at the source of it, fumbling blindly for the brakes, slamming to a halt as my mind tried to process the sight before me. That creeping, eerie feeling that had crawled through me now seemed to intensify in the milky white of the clouded eyes that stared at me. That dog. Sitting there on the grass verge, just in front of the hedgerow, was the same misty-eyed creature that had been haunting my nightmares for several weeks now. Its gaze was fixed on me, the eyes giving me that same feeling that there was something else watching me from behind them. Sitting on the verge, it wagged its tail, as though eager to see me. It was definitely the same dog, only now its fur was much less matted, looking healthier, even glossy in places. Its frame was bulkier than before now, actual muscle visible beneath its skin, as opposed to the sinew and bone that it had been composed of on our first meeting. What the hell was it doing here? We were miles out from town. It had taken me an hour to drive here, and that was in a car. There was no way it would have been able to follow me all of the way out here. And the chances of it wandering out this way on its own were laughable. What did it want? Why did it keep following me? All of these questions reeled around in my head as I stared, slack-jawed, at the creature inexplicably sat in front of me. I just couldn't believe it. Then, the sound of my uncle's voice bubbled its way up, overpowering the spiraling questions, bringing with it a creeping dread that threatened to consume me. Once they latch onto something, or someone, they don't tend to go away. Was he right? Had this thing latched onto me already? Was it going to follow me wherever I went, always appearing just around a corner, no matter how far I ran? The dread and desperation that loomed over me seemed to come crashing down as these thoughts repeated over and over. Why me? Why couldn't it just leave me alone? Go and choose someone else? I looked up again into those milky white eyes as they stared into me, looking like they didn't belong to it. As I stared, the fear and desperation began to evolve, growing and writhing into a blistering sea of rage. It had latched onto me. I'd make it regret it. I'd make it leave me alone, make it go away. I just wanted to be left alone. I wanted everything to go back to normal. Opening the car door and standing at my full height, I frantically scanned around for something nearby. Anything. Anything at all that I could use as a makeshift weapon. Spying a large stick near the base of the nearest hedge, I grasped it firmly in my hand, testing the weight before charging at the dog. I screamed at the top of my lungs, releasing all of my terror and anger. I was yelling so loudly that I'm sure it would be echoing for miles around, scaring any animals nearby back into their lairs. The dog's expression turned to one of fear, and for a moment, I almost allowed myself to feel pity for it. Its eyes were the only thing that stopped me. The dead, milky eyes were still emanating that unnatural feeling as they drilled into me. The fear in the creature's face was no way reflected in those horrible eyes, as though it was just a mask. As I closed the distance, it turned and fled, yelping as it vanished into the undergrowth of a nearby field. Roaring in frustration, I hurled the stick with two hands, watching as it flew through the air towards the place that the dog had been. The frantic rustling of the undergrowth seemed to grow distant as the dog fled, before it vanished entirely, and I was left standing in the middle of the road, alone. As the fury that had taken hold of me seemed to slowly ebb away, I became aware of my own haggard breathing, sounding like an injured animal. My heartbeat was pounding in my ears like a thundering drum. Looking down at my hands, they were visibly shaking, and I felt weak in my knees. Shakily, I started to make my way back along the road to my car. I'd done it though. I'd chased it off. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that would be all it took. Maybe it would leave me alone now. I'd hopefully know for sure once my uncle found a bit more about it. Stopping dead, I nearly collapsed on my already shaking legs as the strength that remained was ripped violently away with a sudden realization. My uncle. Mustering all of the energy that I could, I frantically ran back up the gravel driveway, passing my car by in a blur of movement. My vision tunneled as my eyes fixed on the large oak doors at the entrance of the manor. I couldn't think straight. I didn't know what to do. All I knew was that I needed to get to the doors, and get there as fast as I could. My mind was going a mile a minute, thoughts competing for their brief moment in the spotlight, clambering over one another in a writhing mass. My legs burned with each step, screaming with the strain I was exerting on them. Still, it felt as though I was running through treacle. All the while the door only inching closer until, with a heavy slam, I collided with it, bursting through it and tumbling into a pile on the cold marble floor. My screams echoed, bouncing around the large decorated halls, as my eyes locked with the blue, strangled face lying on the floor before me. Purple veins snaked their way across the cold surface that was once the face of my uncle. He was lying on his front, inches away from me, his face looking up towards the door in a mask of abject terror and pain. Thick white foam lined the edges of his cold, thin lips, leaking down before pooling on the velvet of his housecoat. His thin, wispy hair was sprawled out in several directions, frantic and panicked. But the worst part was his eyes. The ones I'd seen as soon as I fell through the door. Those eyes had etched themselves into my memory forever. My uncle's eyes, so youthful and caring, were gone. The eyes that met mine were cold, dead and milky white. Even in this unmoving, unblinking state, it felt as if they were drilling into me, their cold gaze causing an eerie feeling to crawl through me, mingling with my fear and grief. I crawled backwards, slipping across the marble floor, trying to get away from the corpse in front of me. All the while my uncle's lifeless eyes seemed to follow me, watching me fumbling away. The sudden, solid plaster of the walls met my back as I came to a halt, trapping me. I broke down, tears rolling from my eyes before streaming down my face. I'd known my uncle for less than a day, and now he was dead. All because of me. If I'd never shown up here, if I'd never come for him to help, then the dog would never have followed me, and he would still be alive. This was all my fault. My vision blurred by my tears, I took my phone with shaking hands and called for the emergency services. The operator asked me the usual questions, and I must have answered her, but my mind was too fixated on what had happened to remember what was said. All I could think was about how I was responsible for all this. I'd killed my uncle. Even if I hadn't done it myself, it was still my fault. The milky white orbs of his eyes were still staring out from the blue of his face, looking into me, filling me with an unbearable sense of guilt. The feeling of loneliness washed over me again as I realized that the only person who had believed me, the only person who'd wanted to help, was gone. I was alone again, alone and at the mercy of that dog. It had found me, even here, so far away from town where I'd seen it before. Exhausted by the grief I was feeling, my head collapsed into my hands, shuddering with the chilling realization that wherever I went, this thing would probably follow. I don't know how long I sat there like that, tears dripping into a small pool as they leaked from my hands onto the marble floor. Time ceased to mean anything, and all of my senses grew numb. After some time, I became aware of sounds around me. People shouting. Someone crouching, speaking to me. I didn't look up. Couldn't. I couldn't look into the face of my uncle again. Someone helped me to my feet, taking me outside and into the cool air before sitting me down on the back of an ambulance and wrapping me in a blanket. Although my body was present, it was like I was watching everything unfold through a distorted lens. The people bustling around mere blurry shapes with no defined features. One such shape was standing to my left, asking me several questions. I could hear the sound of my own voice answering him, hear words coming out of my mouth, but my conscious brain had no part in them. I just couldn't tear my eyes away from the double doors leading to the manor. Several shapes were exiting, clad in blurry green. They were pushing another shape between them, large and grey, rolling on wheels. Something was lining the top, buried underneath a white sheet. I couldn't look away as I watched them wheel the trolley towards the ambulance, before lifting it in and vanishing from view, closing the doors behind them. The police officer, obviously seeing how devastated I was by what I'd witnessed this afternoon, gave me his sympathies before telling me that he would likely be in touch again, and not to leave town. I don't remember if I even acknowledged him as he said goodbye, before getting into his car and vanishing along the gravel road along with the ambulance, their crimson taillights refracting into long trails through my tears. Then I was alone again, in the slowly darkening driveway, alone with my thoughts and my guilt. I don't remember driving home. All that I can remember are the whirling questions that spun around in my mind. What if it's me? What if I'm somehow making this dog appear and these people die? I had no idea how it would be possible. But then, I had no idea how people dying when the dog appeared was possible either. I was the only one who seemed to be able to see this thing. My boss had thought I was going crazy, and the people by the other accidents hadn't seen a trace of it, although it should have passed right by them. It wasn't out of the realm of possibility that it was somehow responding specifically to me. But then again, because no one else had seen it, all of this could still be in my head. There was no evidence that the dog was actually real, only that I'd somehow been in the vicinity of 4 people around the time that they died. Once they latch onto something, or someone, they don't tend to go away. That sentence rang around in my head again, worming its way to the surface. If it was real, was it even a dog? How did it choose to appear? My thoughts whirled as they began to take a darker turn. Why had it chosen to appear now, today, Had it decided to kill my uncle? Because he offered to help me? Was it worried that he would succeed? The dog's form appeared in my thoughts. That same sack of taut skin and bones clad with matted tangled fur that it had been when I first encountered it. Its glassy white eyes stared forward as it began to slowly morph, its frame filling out, its fur becoming more glossy and clean, until it resembled the dog I'd seen on the road earlier today. How was it changing each time I saw it? How had it gone from the near-dead whelp that I'd first seen to the near-perfect specimen of a dog it was now? It always seemed to change after an accident, like they were transforming it somehow, strengthening it. I tried to shake myself free from the cascading waves of my thoughts, trying to think of anything else that might take my mind away for 2 seconds. Images of my wife floated up in my mind. Claire, bringing temporary relief from the oppressive thoughts. I thought about our wedding day, me in my suit, her in her flowing white dress, smiling from ear to ear. And for a moment, I felt the stirrings of a peaceful calm in my head. As the image of Claire spun around, the shaggy form of the dog appeared in my memory, dragging my thoughts back to the oppressive dread that I'd so desperately been trying to escape. What if this thing appeared at my home, when Claire was there? What if it decided to take her too? A cold slithered through me as I imagined its pale, dead eyes staring at me as my wife collapsed in the next room. I couldn't let that happen. I wouldn't. I didn't know what I could do. All I knew is that I would do anything in my power to keep her safe. I don't know what it was that pulled my attention from the maelstrom of thoughts. If it was the sound of the other cars, the familiar sight of my street, or the sounds of children playing in the distance. All I knew was that somehow, even with my thoughts writhing like a mass of agitated insects, I'd driven myself home. I was cruising along my street, nearly at the door to my house. Looking back at it now, it's a miracle that I didn't kill anyone with how little attention I've been paying on the road. As the car powered along, bringing me ever closer to my destination, I looked around with a newfound awareness. The street, once a calm, secure sight, filled me with dread. I looked at each of the houses, noting all of the tight spots and hidden corners, expecting some kind of furry tail to be wagging just out of sight. If that dog was following me, it could be hiding anywhere, waiting for me. A jolt of fear ran through me, cold and icy, as I saw the movement of something by the side of one of my neighbour's houses. It couldn't be here, could it? Not again. Not so soon after I last saw it. I couldn't bear to look. I wasn't strong enough to go through that again. But I needed to know. Forcing myself to turn my eyes over to the side of that house again, I looked, all the while expecting to see the cloudy, wet orbs of the dog's eyes staring back at me in the distance. I let out the breath I'd been holding as relief swam through me. It was a dog, but it was completely different. A border collie, someone's pet. Its black and white coat darted around the garden, chasing a flock of birds flying overhead. My heart was beating a mile a minute as I tried to calm myself. Sure, it wasn't there this time, but there's nothing to say it wouldn't be hiding around the next corner. Focusing my gaze forward, I continued driving, not looking at the streets on either side of me for fear of the glassy white eyes that could be waiting for me anywhere. I needed to get home, to get to Claire. I'd be safe there, I thought, although a nagging part of me questioned how I could possibly know that for sure. My gaze was still fixed on the road in front of the car as I slowed to a crawl and gently turned into my driveway. It was dark now, the beams of my headlights illuminating the outside of the house in their warm glow. Coming to a stop and turning off the engine, I stepped out. the weight of my limbs threatening to pull me to the ground. I was exhausted, running on empty. I didn't know how much longer I could go on like this. Making my way to the door, I fumbled with the key in the lock before it finally connected and turned with a click. Trying to put on my best attempt at a composed face, I stepped into the house. I knew Claire was still worried about me from last night, so seeing me like this would only make things worse. Closing and locking the door behind me, I could hear footsteps in the kitchen getting closer. "Finally, you're back. Dinner's ready. I'm just plating." The porcelain dish filled with pasta that she was holding filled the air with a tinkling sound as it fell from her hands to the ground, shattering. Oblivious to the bolognese sauce now spreading across the floor, she ran to me, embracing me and asking me what had happened. I broke down in her arms again, for the second time in as many days, and cried harder than I ever thought I could. I explained about my uncle, explained about that dog again, and then what I'd seen in the manor when I ran through those doors. The eyes seemed to stare out through my memory, as though still looking into me. Her composure finally broke when I told her how it had been my fault. How that thing was obviously following me. How it wouldn't have killed him if he hadn't offered to help me. I knew how insane I sounded, how unbelievable this all was. But I didn't care. I just needed someone to know what was happening, someone to understand. She took care of me for the rest of that evening, sitting with me and stroking my hair in an attempt to calm me. She hardly ever left my side, only to get me a drink or some food. I think she was worried about what I might do if she wasn't around. Either way, I appreciated it. In the days that followed, I didn't leave the house. I couldn't bring myself to. That thing was still out there, waiting for me, where I least expected it. And if I stayed in here, then that harbinger of death wouldn't be able to kill anyone else because of me. As long as it couldn't get to me, then everyone would be safe. If only it had been that simple.